Hello and welcome to this introductory video on how to paint miniatures for wargaming or other purposes. I was inspired to make this video by a post on Reddit asking what does it mean when you say to thin your paints. So I'm going to demonstrate that here today, hopefully giving you some very basic ideas on what that means and how to get paint on your little toy men. What you'll need is, of course, a miniature. This one is primed, which is not something I'll go over today, but it's just brushed on black paint. In terms of consistency, that's basically the same as what the rest of what I'll be doing. I've got some size 1 brushes just to give you an idea of the kind of variety that you can use. I'll probably be using this one because it's in the best shape at the moment. As you go on, you'll get more and more. It doesn't really matter if they're expensive or cheap. They all kind of get destroyed by the process eventually anyway. They are expendable. For that reason, I like to use synthetic brushes because Sagball brushes are made from really cute animals, and that makes me sad. You also need something to put water in. You need nice, clean water because anything that's in your water is going on your model. You want to change your water while you're painting, ideally between colours, but at minimum, between metals and colours. You could use anything to put this in that's comfortable for you. This is just part of the bug trapper that I originally decided to purpose for painting 20-something years ago. I've seen people use McDonald's cups, takeaway cups, old mugs like this one. And speaking of brushes, there's a lot of variety, a lot of different types of brushes that you can use. You'll need a palette, which was this first thing that I showed you. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be anything non-porous. Eventually you'll want something called a wet palette, but at the very least you want to be putting it on a solid surface and not competing with the thing that you're putting on absorbing it. So this cutting mat that I'm using here is a backdrop, no good. Paper, no good. If you've seen the old Duncan Rhodes videos where he just brushes paint onto a paper, I'm pretty sure that that's just a scheme to get you to waste more paint. Sort of an upgrade from that is a professional artist palette or a tile like this one. And eventually you probably want to move to a wet palette because it keeps your paints wetter for longer. This one is based on a tutorial by Uncle Adam, and it's been pretty good to me. So you got your model, and by the way, ignore the handle. That's not necessary. I just use it because I've had a couple of hand injuries over the years, and this makes it a lot easier for me. You want to start out by taking your palette, and apologies for the terrible angle. I'm doing this standing up because I'm a bit unwell at the moment, but hopefully that'll get through. You want to start with our paint. Shake the absolute heck out of it. Because it's made up of several different materials and they need to be combined to work properly. I use Citadel paints because I paint Citadel models, and this is what I learned to paint with, and the consistency is what works for me. And we're about to have a little visit from my cat. Don't let your cat drink paint water. Shaking up the paint. Get some of it onto the brush. Like that. Do not put this directly on the model. You'll end up in one of those parody videos where it's all the Marines screaming. It'll be thick, it'll be gluggy, and it'll obscure detail. This is what you want to start with, but you don't put it on the model like this. You put it on the palette. And you want to get almost all of it off. Now, ultimately, that's kind of what your brush is going to look like before you touch the model. But you want one more step, and that's to get some water onto your brush like that and mix it in on the palette. If you've got a well-loved palette like mine, you know that it's kind of ready when it starts adhering to the contours of the paint that's there already. Some people like to say, 2% milk or 50-50 ratio or whatever, but ultimately it's something that you're just going to have to learn. I think that's a bit thinner than I want, so I'm going to put a bit more in. And the reason for this is twofold. One, so that it doesn't obscure detail on your model, and two, so that it doesn't dry out as quickly, especially if you've got a dry palette like this one. Got to bit more, just so that the whole thing holds up. If you've got a dry palette like this one, your paint's going to be evaporating. It's going to be drying on the palette, the same as if it was on a model. And miniature paints dry pretty quickly. So you want to have water on the palette, and that's why the wet palette is so good later on. But just to start with, you want to put water in it, in all of it, so that it doesn't dry out real quick. And just having a quick look at my brush, that's kind of where we want it. This is a Citadel base paint, so we can get away with a bit more than we might otherwise. And this is the first coat. So we take a model and put it on, and you can see, you should be able to see, you can kind of see the base coat underneath. That's okay. This is what people mean when they say too thin coats and all of the memes. It's because the first time you put the paint on, you're going to be able to see a lot of the undercoat underneath. And that's a sign that you've done it right. You don't want the undercoat to be completely obscured the first time you put a layer of paint on it. You want it to be a little bit see-through. That's the sign that you've done it right. Because you know it's thin, you know it's not going to destroy any work that you put into modeling it or sculpting it, and it's not going to destroy the sculpt. Now, if I had any editing skills, I'd wait for this to dry, but I'm just going to keep going until I reckon that the legs are dry. You don't want to just keep putting paint on paint on paint, because that starts preventing it from drying and tearing up the previous layers. So if I just go back onto that, for example, you see it's got sort of brushstroke texture. That's no good. We don't like that. Instead, what you want is for that to dry. You can see I'm going back, getting more paint. And that's as the, it's a bit too much. That's as the amount of paint on the brush, because it's a liquid, there's paint on the brush, and it doesn't just sort of magically transfer color onto the model. What's happening is that the liquid is flowing from the brush onto the miniature. Again, another reason why the water is helpful. And I'm terribly sorry about the shitty framing. This is the first time I've tried to do this on camera. And having the camera between me and the model is a bit awkward, and I'm standing up, and this, and the lighting's bad, all of that. And you can see that I'm sort of going back and relayering back on the areas that I did at the start. Because that first layer had started to dry enough that I'm not going to tear it up as I put on the next. And you see that that coverage is much better. It's still not perfect. It's still not flat and smooth like you might see a professional painter. But that's okay. It doesn't need to be. Because ultimately, you'll be putting on layers of shading and highlights, which will obscure a lot of them. And the main thing for the base coat is to get the color in all the recesses, in the darkest parts of the model. So just sort of keep working your way around it, going over again and again, until you've got some nice coverage. And especially if it's your first couple of models, that's good enough. It's done. It's painted. There you go. That's how you put paint on a model, and that's what we mean when we say thin your paints. And you can still see all of the details on this miniature, or you could if my lighting was better. The point isn't to get one thick coat when you're brushing on your base coat. The point is to get smooth, even color. And that's going to take a couple more layers for this particular model with the thinning level of thinning that I've done. But that gives you an idea, I hope. Thank you very much for watching.